He was a man of faith. Pastor Elijah Moore, a husband, a father, a preacher, respected by his church, trusted by his community. Every Sunday he stood at the pulpit, preaching about righteousness, family, and the fear of God. But behind that holy smile, behind the carefully ironed suit, lived a darkness so deep, even the devil might have taken a step back. It all started with a girl, innocent, bright, and barely out of school. Rachel Carter. She wasn't just another church member, she was his daughter's best friend. A regular face at the Moore family dinner table. A girl who once called him Uncle Elijah, and would later call him her child's father. When the truth came out, the scandal shook the entire congregation. But this wasn't just a story of forbidden love or a secret affair. It was something far more sinister. A chilling descent into madness, fueled by obsession, lust, and the fear of losing control. When his wife, Teresa Moore, discovered the affair, she didn't just confront him, she threatened to expose him. His daughter, Naomi Moore, shattered by the betrayal, turned her back on him. Everything Elijah had built, every lie he had protected, was collapsing like a house of cards. And that's when the mask came off. In one blood-soaked night, Pastor Elijah did the unthinkable. He didn't just try to cover up his sins, he erased his entire family. One by one. Then, in a shocking twist no one could have predicted, he married Rachel. 3 days later, the same pastor, who thought he'd gotten away with everything, was found dead. Alone. Silent. Cold. Was it guilt? Revenge? Divine punishment? Or did he simply realize that even if the world forgave him, his own soul never would? This is the story of a man who wore the robe of holiness, while hiding the heart of a monster. A man who destroyed the people he was meant to protect. All for a desire he should have buried deep inside. And in the end he paid the ultimate price. This is the family crime exposed. By all accounts, Pastor Elijah Moore was everything a spiritual leader should be. A man of integrity. A father figure. A voice of wisdom in a chaotic world. In the quiet town of Evergreen Hills, his name carried weight, not because of power but because of the peace he seemed to bring with him. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drive expensive cars or wear designer suits. Elijah was simple, humble, and deeply respected. He preached in a modest white church that had stood at the corner of Maple and 7th for decades. On Sundays the pews were always full. On Wednesdays his Bible study group spilled into the hallway. People came not just to hear the word, but to hear it from him. To his congregation he was more than a pastor. He was a healer, a counselor, a rock. He officiated weddings, comforted grieving families, prayed over newborn babies, and sat beside the sick. He had a smile that put people at ease, and a voice that made even the harshest truths feel like gentle rain. But those who knew him more intimately, his wife Teresa and his daughter Naomi, they saw a different side. Still kind. Still devoted. But sometimes distant. Silent. As if something inside him was locked away. Elijah rarely spoke of his past. Born into a broken home, he found God in his teenage years. Some said religion saved him. Others whispered that he clung to the church not just out of faith, but to escape the man he used to be. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Pastor Moore had reinvented himself. Teresa had been with him from the beginning. She was there when he preached his first sermon to a room of just 6 people. She stood by him through financial struggles, helped raise Naomi, and supported every step of his ministry. Together, they were the picture of unity, faith, family. But even perfect pictures can hide cracks. Behind the pulpit, Elijah spoke of temptation as a distant enemy, something to be fought with scripture and strength. But in truth, his battle with temptation was far more personal. He often counseled young women in the church, always in private, always with care. Some found his attention comforting. Others found it too familiar. Still, no one questioned him. After all, he was Elijah Moore, the man who never missed a Sunday, never raised his voice in anger, never had a stain on his record. But maybe that was the problem. When a man is put on a pedestal, no one sees the shadows gathering at his feet. And then came Rachel Carter. She was just 16 when she first stepped into the church with Naomi. They became fast friends, inseparable really. Rachel came from a troubled home. Her father had walked out. Her mother worked nights. The Moore family became a safe place, a second home. And Pastor Elijah? He became someone she could trust, talk to, look up to. He was always there to listen, to guide, to pray with her when she was scared, to check in when she missed school. It all seemed so innocent, so wholesome. Until it wasn't. The line between spiritual guidance and personal obsession began to blur, and Elijah was the one crossing it. Slowly. carefully. Almost as if he believed that because he wore the cloth he was untouchable. To the outside world he was still the man of God. Still giving sermons about purity, loyalty, and truth. But inside the Moore household the atmosphere had shifted. Teresa noticed it first, the long stares, the subtle changes in his behavior, the way he suddenly seemed to care a little too much about Naomi's friend. She brought it up once. He brushed it off. "You're overthinking it," he said with a calm smile. "She's just a child who needs love and direction." But love eventually became something else. And direction? It turned into manipulation. No one suspected. No one looked closely. Who would dare question the pastor? Elijah knew this. He counted on it. The very thing that had built his reputation, the trust of his community, was now his shield. His protection. His weapon. He had become a master of duality. On Sundays he preached about the sanctity of family. On weekdays he found excuses to be alone with Rachel. His sermons were full of fire and conviction. His private moments? Filled with secrets. And through it all his wife stood by his side. Loyal. Loving. Blind. Naomi, too, never imagined her father could betray her. To her, he was still the man who tucked her in at night, taught her to ride a bike, prayed over her when she was sick. But beneath that familiar exterior, something had changed. Something she couldn't quite put into words. The man of God was becoming a stranger. But no one saw it. Not yet. Because monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they stand in the light, holding a Bible and smiling as the world praises them. And Pastor Elijah Moore was no longer just a trusted figure. He was a ticking time bomb, cloaked in scripture, waiting to explode. Rachel Carter wasn't the kind of girl who commanded attention when she entered a room. She didn't have the vivacity or charm that people like Naomi Moore, Pastor Elijah's daughter, seemed to possess so effortlessly. Rachel was quieter, reserved. In fact, she often felt like a shadow in the corners of her own life. Yet, somehow she had a way of drawing people in even if they didn't realize it. She was only 16 when she first crossed paths with the Moore family. Naomi, her best friend, had been a fixture in her life since childhood. Naomi's life was a contrast to Rachel's own. Where Naomi's home was warm, filled with laughter and love, Rachel's home had always felt like a cold place. Her parents had split when she was young, and her mother, Laura Carter, was often absent, working late nights to keep food on the table. Rachel didn't resent her mother, she understood the struggle. But it didn't fill the emptiness inside her. The Moore family, on the other hand, had everything Rachel longed for. Pastor Elijah Moore was the leader of the local church, a man who exuded warmth and kindness. His wife, Teresa, was gentle and welcoming, and their daughter, Naomi, was the perfect role model. The Moores seemed to have it all, the perfect family, the perfect life, the perfect faith. For Rachel, the Moores weren't just another family, they were a sanctuary. It was Naomi who invited Rachel to stay with them more often, especially when her own home was empty. Rachel would show up after school and stay until the evening. The meals they shared at the Moores were always full of warmth. Elijah would often offer his thoughts on the world, speaking about faith, family, and the importance of staying true to one's values. To Rachel it felt like a dream. She had never experienced anything like it. Elijah was a man who commanded respect, not just from his congregation, but from anyone who crossed his path. His presence in the room was always calming, always reassuring. People listened to him with rapt attention when he spoke. Rachel, on the other hand, had spent years being overlooked, never feeling like she measured up. But with Elijah she felt seen for the first time in her life. He asked her about her day, about school, about everything. His interest was genuine and Rachel soaked it up. She didn't know why it meant so much, but it did. At first it seemed harmless. Elijah was a father figure, nothing more. He was kind, offering advice and guidance when needed. But, little by little, the lines started to blur. He would compliment her often, on her appearance, on her intelligence, on her maturity. At first Rachel took it in stride. Naomi would laugh it off, telling Rachel that her father treated everyone like that. But as the days passed, Rachel began to notice something different in Elijah's demeanor. His compliments felt less like casual remarks and more like something deeper, something heavier. It was subtle at first, little touches here and there. A hand resting a moment too long on her shoulder, a brush of fingers as he handed her a cup of tea. And when he looked at her, it wasn't just with fatherly concern. His eyes lingered. It was as though he saw something in her that she didn't see in herself. And that look? It unsettled her, but she didn't know how to explain it. Rachel tried to ignore it. After all, Pastor Elijah was a man of God, respected by everyone in their community. He would never do anything wrong, would he? But the confusion began to weigh on her. She had never felt special before, never had someone like him pay this kind of attention to her. And the more it happened, the more she began to crave it. One afternoon, when Naomi was out with her friends, Rachel stayed behind at the Moore house. Elijah was in the study working on his sermon, but he invited her in to chat. They spoke about life, faith, and their personal struggles. For the first time, Rachel found herself opening up to him about things she had never told anyone else, about the pain of losing her father, about the loneliness she often felt at home. Elijah listened with empathy, nodding gently as he spoke words of comfort. He told her that she was special and that God had a plan for her, words that felt both sincere and comforting. Then, in a moment that would haunt Rachel for a long time, Elijah reached out and gently placed his hand on her knee. It wasn't rough or abrupt. It was soft, almost reassuring. But it lingered longer than was appropriate, and Rachel froze. She didn't know what to do. It wasn't like anything she had experienced before. Her body tensed, her heart raced, and she felt a mix of confusion and fear. But she didn't pull away. Why didn't she pull away? Rachel didn't have an answer. All she knew was that in that moment, Elijah was giving her something she had never received from anyone else. In his eyes, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. She was important. And that feeling felt too good to reject. She began to rationalize it. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe it was just a moment of comfort, a fatherly gesture, and nothing more. But deep down she knew it was more than that. It wasn't something that would disappear. It was a seed planted in the dark corners of her heart. Over the next few weeks, Elijah's behavior became harder to ignore. The touches grew more frequent, more purposeful. He'd offer her more attention, more personal conversations. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to speak up. Part of her wanted to believe that it was just her imagination. But another part of her feared the truth, that perhaps she was being drawn into something that would destroy everything she had once believed in. Rachel found herself trapped in a web of confusion, torn between the kindness Elijah had shown her and the growing realization that something wasn't right. Yet, despite the guilt gnawing at her, she couldn't find the strength to step away, because she was finally seen. And that was something she could never let go of. The Moore family had long been regarded as pillars of their community. Pastor Elijah Moore, with his deep voice and unwavering conviction, had led his congregation with the kind of charisma that made even the most skeptical believe in his words. His sermons were powerful, full of passion, filled with the Word of God, and laced with a sense of purity and faith. His family, the epitome of what any churchgoer would consider ideal, was admired by all. Naomi, his daughter, was the perfect reflection of this ideal. Beautiful, smart, respectful, she was everything a father could want in a daughter. And Rachel Carter, her best friend, was just an innocent girl looking for a place to belong. But what lay beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family was a secret so dark, it would eventually tear their world apart. The first whisper of that secret came quietly, almost unnoticed. Pastor Elijah's gaze would linger just a little too long when Rachel entered a room. A glance here, a touch there, nothing overt, nothing that would immediately raise alarms. But for Rachel, who had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, it was enough. She began to notice the way Elijah looked at her, the way his hand would rest too long on her shoulder, the way his compliments seemed just a little too personal. At first she brushed it off. After all, he was her best friend's father, a man of God, someone who had always been kind to her. But as the days went by, the boundary between pastor and parishioner, father and daughter's best friend, began to blur. Rachel was no longer just a guest in the Moore home. She was something else entirely. Something more complicated. And yet she didn't understand it. She didn't know how to define it. Elijah didn't start the affair with any grand declarations of love or intent. He didn't need to. He was a master of subtlety. Every touch, every lingering word, every look was carefully calculated, each one another thread in the web he was spinning. It wasn't about love, not in the way anyone would think. It was about control, manipulation, and something much darker. He saw Rachel not as a daughter's friend but as something less pure. She was a blank canvas, someone ripe for the kind of influence only a man in his position could exert. Rachel, with all her quiet loneliness, with her need for validation, was the perfect target. She had no idea that every kind word he spoke, every show of affection, was part of a much darker design. A design to groom her, to manipulate her into believing that she was the only one who mattered. And slowly Rachel began to believe it. Slowly the kind words became something more. Elijah began to convince her that their connection was special, that it was destiny. He told her that she was chosen for something greater, something that only the two of them could understand. When he spoke of God's plans, it wasn't just about faith anymore. It was about them, about what they shared, this unspoken bond that no one else could comprehend. But the affair didn't start with a kiss. It started with whispers. It began with Elijah telling Rachel how special she was, how much God had a plan for her life. And then it moved to more physical gestures. A hand resting a moment too long on her shoulder, the way he would walk her to the door, holding her hand just a bit too firmly. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but part of her couldn't deny that the attention felt good, soothing even. It filled the empty spaces she didn't even realize were there. The first time Elijah kissed Rachel was at the height of a quiet evening in the Moore home. Naomi was out with friends, leaving Rachel and Elijah alone in the living room. They were sitting on the couch, talking, about life, about faith, about everything and nothing at all. But in that moment the words stopped. And without a single word spoken, Elijah leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first. Rachel, frozen in place, didn't know how to react. But then his lips pressed harder, more urgently, and something inside her twisted. Fear. Confusion. Desire. She wanted to pull away but she couldn't. The flood of emotions coursing through her was overwhelming. This was wrong. She knew that. But it felt like a part of her had been awakened in ways she had never imagined. And for Elijah, it was just the beginning. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But for Elijah it was part of the plan. He would play his part and he would win. As the days passed, the affection grew, no longer hidden behind glances or innocent touches. He began to weave a narrative around Rachel, convincing her that what they were doing wasn't wrong, that it was part of something greater. They had a bond, a connection that no one else could understand. God had brought them together for a reason. The guilt that Rachel felt every time she saw Naomi was unbearable. How could she face her best friend, knowing what had happened between her and her father? But Elijah, ever the master manipulator, told her not to worry. Naomi won't understand, he would say. You don't need to explain anything to her. What we share is between us. And that's how it began. In secret. In whispers. The affair between Pastor Elijah and Rachel became their hidden world. No one could know. No one could understand. And the more they hid it, the more powerful the secret became. Elijah had not only taken Rachel's innocence but had twisted her understanding of right and wrong. In his eyes it was all justified, a part of some divine plan, a path that they were meant to walk together. But no secret stays hidden forever. What began as subtle manipulation soon morphed into something far more destructive. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about power, control. And Elijah, in his twisted righteousness, believed that he was above reproach. He was the man of God after all. And soon, it was clear that the repercussions of this secret would be far more devastating than either of them could have imagined. The Moore family had long been the picture of stability. Pastor Elijah Moore, with his deep voice and commanding presence, had earned the admiration of his congregation, and his family was always by his side, a reflection of his faith and good deeds. He was a man who preached love, loyalty, and righteousness, often reminding his flock that the foundation of any strong community was the strength of the family. His wife, Teresa, was the quiet support behind him, always present at his side, holding everything together. Naomi, their daughter, was the pride of the family, gracious, well-spoken, and always obedient. Everything about the Moore family seemed perfect, until the mask began to crack. It started with the whispers. No one had dared to speak up at first. Naomi, so consumed with the busy life of being the pastor's daughter, never suspected the tension building just beneath the surface. Rachel, her best friend, had always been a part of the Moore family. Their bond had grown over the years, and Naomi never thought twice about how close Rachel had become to her father. But as time went on, something changed. Rachel began to distance herself from Naomi, and she didn't know why. She thought it was just the growing pains of adolescence. Maybe Rachel had new friends, or maybe she was simply becoming more independent. But Naomi could never have imagined what was actually happening in her own home, right under her nose. For months, the signs were subtle. Rachel's avoidance of the Moore household. The strange distance between her and Pastor Elijah. Small, fleeting moments when Rachel's eyes would dart nervously, and she would rush to leave when Naomi's parents walked into the room. Naomi didn't think much of it at first. She chalked it up to the usual teenage drama. But the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. And then, one fateful evening, Naomi would learn the horrifying truth that had been hidden for far too long. It all began with a simple question. Naomi had returned home early from a weekend retreat with her friends and found her mother in the kitchen. She could tell something was wrong. Teresa, usually so calm, had a strange look in her eyes. The air in the house felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Naomi walked into the kitchen, a small smile on her face, but the moment she saw her mother's face, the smile faltered. "Mom?" Naomi asked, her voice tentative. "What's going on?" Teresa hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the dish towel in her hands. She looked up, meeting Naomi's gaze with a sadness that was hard to read. "Naomi, you need to sit down." The word struck Naomi like a thunderclap. "What is it, Mom? What's wrong?" Her mother's voice trembled as she spoke. "It's about your father and Rachel." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. The confusion on her face must have been obvious because her mother took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "Naomi, there are things about your father that you don't know. Things that have been going on for far too long." Naomi's mind raced. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Teresa seemed to falter, struggling to find the right words. "It's an affair, Naomi. Your father has been involved with Rachel. For months. It's been going on behind our backs." The world seemed to slow down as the words sank in. Naomi could barely comprehend what her mother was saying. Her father, her rock, her protector, the man who had preached about loyalty, faith, and righteousness, had betrayed their family in the most unimaginable way. "Rachel?" Naomi whispered, barely able to believe it. "But she's my best friend, Mom. She's like family." Tears welled up in her mother's eyes as she nodded, the weight of the truth breaking through the fragile composure she had been holding on to. "I know, sweetheart. I don't know how it happened, but it has. And it's been going on for far too long." Naomi stumbled back as though she had been physically struck. Her world shattered in that moment. The person she had trusted most, the person who had led their family with such unwavering confidence, had lied to them all. Her father's betrayal was the last thing she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the affair itself, it was the layers of deception, the manipulation, the lies he had told to keep his secret safe. The truth was more horrifying than Naomi could have ever anticipated. She felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak all at once. And the worst part was that she couldn't even trust her best friend anymore. Rachel, someone she had shared everything with, was now a part of the very thing that was destroying her family. Naomi's thoughts were in turmoil. She had to confront her father. She had to hear the truth from him. But as she prepared to face him, the weight of everything that had been hidden, everything that had been betrayed, almost overwhelmed her. When Naomi confronted Pastor Elijah, the man who had been the pillar of her life, the facade began to crumble. For the first time, Elijah looked defeated. Not the confident, all-knowing man he had always been, but a man who was caught, cornered, and who couldn't hide behind the mask of perfection any longer. "I'm sorry," he whispered, as if the apology could somehow make up for the years of lies. "Naomi, I never wanted you to find out like this. But I'm afraid it's too late to hide it now." Naomi's heart shattered at the sight of her father, a man she had once seen as a perfect example of faith and morality, reduced to someone who had betrayed everything he had ever preached. It was too much to process. Her best friend, the man who had always been her protector, the man who had held up the very ideals she had lived by, had crushed them all in one reckless act of selfishness. The family, once so united, began to fracture. Naomi couldn't look at her father the same way anymore. Rachel, once the sister she had never had, was now the person who had destroyed everything they had built. And Elijah was no longer the trusted pastor of their church, but a broken man, consumed by his own guilt and the irreversible consequences of his actions. The truth, when it came to light, was far more devastating than anyone had imagined. The Moore family, once the epitome of faith and respect, was now caught in a web of lies and betrayal, things that would take years to heal if they ever could. The revelation of Pastor Elijah Moore's affair with Rachel Carter shattered the Moore family. What had once been a portrait of faith, strength, and unity was now a broken mess, fragmented beyond recognition. Naomi, his daughter, stood at the epicenter of the destruction, reeling from the realization that the man she had looked up to had betrayed her trust in the most unimaginable way. Teresa, his wife, had been torn apart by the betrayal, but the one person who had been affected the most was Elijah himself. He was no longer the man of God, no longer the trusted leader of his congregation. Instead, he was a man consumed by guilt, shame, and rage. The facade he had carefully built for years had crumbled in an instant, and with it, his sense of control over his life. Elijah's downfall was swift. He had spent so much of his life presenting himself as the model of virtue and godliness, Yet behind closed doors, he had fallen into a pit of sin that he could no longer escape. And when the truth came to light, it wasn't just his reputation that was destroyed, it was the very foundation of his family. But the devastation didn't end with the truth. Elijah wasn't just a broken man, he was a dangerous man. The realization of what he had done to his family consumed him, and instead of seeking redemption or forgiveness, he began to spiral deeper into darkness. The betrayal he had committed against his wife and daughter seemed to gnaw at him constantly, driving him to the brink of madness. And in that madness, something twisted and violent was born. Elijah had always been a man of control, a man who held the power to guide his congregation and lead his family. But now, with everything slipping through his fingers, he saw only one way to regain control: to eliminate the source of his shame, his guilt, the very family that had once worshipped him. It was a cold, dark night when the plan began to take shape in Elijah's mind. He sat alone in his study, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His hands shook as he gripped the Bible in front of him, the book that had once been his anchor. Now it felt like a symbol of everything he had destroyed. Teresa, his wife, the woman who had stood by him through everything, and Naomi, his own daughter, the people who had loved him unconditionally, were now nothing more than obstacles in his path to redemption. His mind raced. He couldn't let them ruin everything. They had exposed him. They had torn apart the life he had built. And worst of all, Rachel, the girl he had betrayed his family for, was gone. She had cut ties with him, terrified of the consequences of their affair. It left him feeling even more abandoned, even more desperate. But in his desperation, something inside him snapped. The guilt and anger that had been brewing inside him erupted in a fit of rage. He couldn't bear the thought of facing the world as the man who had lost everything. His pride, his ego, his very identity, all of it was slipping away, and Elijah was willing to go to any length to stop it. In the dead of night, Pastor Elijah made his way to the bedroom where Teresa was sleeping. He moved with quiet determination, his heart racing with both anger and fear. His hand shook as he reached for the drawer where he kept a revolver, a gun he had once bought for protection but had never dreamed he would use. As he stood over his wife, staring down at her sleeping form, a flood of memories washed over him. They had built this life together. They had raised Naomi together. They had been partners in everything. And yet now she was nothing more than a symbol of his shame. Her loyalty, her love, had been a weakness. He had betrayed it, and now he would erase the evidence of his sins. It was the only way to rid himself of the pain, the guilt, the shame. Teresa never saw it coming. She woke to the sound of a muffled shot, her body jerking as the bullet struck her chest. The pain was instant, and before she could even process what had happened, her vision blurred, and the world faded into darkness. But Elijah wasn't finished yet. As the life drained from his wife, his mind fixated on one other person, Naomi, his daughter. The one who had been the most loyal, the one who had loved him unconditionally. She too had betrayed him just by knowing the truth. She couldn't live. She couldn't be allowed to tell anyone what had happened. Naomi had to be silenced. With the gun still in his hand, Elijah moved swiftly to his daughter's bedroom. Naomi, sound asleep, never had a chance to defend herself. The moment he pulled the trigger, her world was over. The blood splattered across the walls, and the once vibrant life of his daughter was extinguished in an instant. He stood over her, breathing heavily, as though the act of killing her was some kind of final release, a way to regain control over everything he had lost. But as he stood there, the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. Elijah looked down at his hands, the blood still fresh, the finality of his actions crashing down on him. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His family was gone, his wife, his daughter, everything that had ever mattered to him. And for what? For the sake of his own pride? For the sake of his own delusions of control? As the night stretched on, the weight of his actions pressed on him. But instead of feeling relief, Elijah was consumed with a terrifying realization. He had destroyed everything that ever mattered. There was no coming back from this. His family was gone. His life was gone. The mask of righteousness he had so carefully crafted had crumbled completely, revealing nothing but the horrific truth beneath. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. The once respected pastor had committed an unimaginable act. The house, once filled with the sound of laughter and faith, was now a crime scene, its walls stained with the blood of those who had loved him most. And Elijah? He was gone. Not physically but mentally. In his madness, in his final moments, he had lost everything, and there was no redemption left to find. The darkness of the Moore household was now complete. Pastor Elijah Moore, the once respected man of faith, had carried out the unthinkable. He had destroyed his own family, silencing the very people who had loved him unconditionally. Naomi and Teresa, both lifeless in their beds, were victims of his twisted need to regain control, to bury the shame that had overtaken him. But no act of violence, no matter how meticulously carried out, can ever escape the consequences of its own nature. Karma had long been watching, and it was only a matter of time before the universe returned what Elijah had so recklessly sown. In the wake of the murders, the town of Glenview was left in shock. The Moore family had been a cornerstone of the community. Elijah had been their spiritual leader, the man who had always guided them with wisdom and faith, offering counsel to the broken and hope to the lost. To hear that such a man had slaughtered his own flesh and blood left the townspeople paralyzed with disbelief. How could this happen? How could someone they had trusted so deeply fall so far? But as the days passed, the truth began to seep through the cracks. Elijah's carefully crafted image of a godly, faithful man began to unravel, revealing the sickening truth behind the mask. Rachel Carter, once the pastor's secret mistress, had gone into hiding, terrified of the repercussions of her involvement. She knew all too well the darkness Elijah had tried to conceal, but even she had underestimated the consequences of their affair. But karma, as it often does, doesn't let even the most cunning escape unscathed. It began with the whispers. Rachel had been staying with a distant relative, far away from the town and the horrors she had witnessed, but she couldn't escape the mounting guilt that gnawed at her. She knew that her role in Elijah's downfall could not be ignored forever. She had been complicit in a crime that no one could understand, least of all her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of Naomi and Teresa, their blood staining the place that had once been their home. As Rachel moved through the motions of her life, her once clear path was clouded by the weight of the past. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just her betrayal of her best friend. It was that she had become a part of something that had destroyed not one but two families. The guilt that haunted her was suffocating, and the fear of being caught was worse. But worse than anything was the knowledge that her involvement in the affair had contributed to the slow and tragic unraveling of the Moore family. How could she live with herself after that? Meanwhile, back in Glenview, the investigation into the Moore family murders had become a growing nightmare for the authorities. Evidence pointed to Pastor Elijah, but as they pieced together the tragic events of that night, they found something that made the situation even darker than anyone could have imagined. The affair. The deception. And ultimately, the realization that Elijah had killed not out of madness alone, but out of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to silence the truth of his sins. The police had their suspicions, but the key to unlocking the final piece of the puzzle lay in the confession of a single person, Rachel Carter. The day the authorities caught up to her, Rachel was sitting in a small diner, half-eaten food in front of her, staring into the distance, lost in thought. She had always been a girl of few words, but now she was a shell of her former self, weighed down by the ghosts of her past. A tap on her shoulder broke her reverie, and she looked up to see a sheriff and a local detective standing in front of her. The last thing she expected was to be caught in the web she had tried so desperately to escape. Rachel Carter? The sheriff's voice was firm, his eyes steely. We need to talk. It was then, in that moment, when Rachel realized that she could no longer outrun the truth. She had been complicit. She had allowed herself to become a part of something too dangerous to ignore. She had known what Elijah was capable of, and she had stayed silent, allowing the destruction to unfold. But as she looked into the faces of the officers, she knew that karma was finally catching up with her. Rachel broke down, confessing everything. She described how the affair had started, how Elijah had manipulated her into believing their relationship was something special, something divine. She spoke of the night the truth was revealed, of the tension in the Moore household, and of the chilling silence that followed. She described the moment Elijah took the gun and shot Teresa, and then Naomi without a moment of hesitation. The sheer coldness of his actions had shocked her, and though she had been complicit, she now felt the full weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest. By the time Rachel's confession had been documented, the news spread like wildfire through Glenview. The town had long suspected something was amiss, but now the truth was finally exposed. Elijah Moore, once the beloved pastor, had been a monster lurking behind a mask of righteousness, and his crimes had shattered everything he had once stood for. Karma had come knocking in the form of truth, and it had caught up with everyone involved. In the end, Rachel was arrested and charged for her role in the affair, though the legal system would forever struggle with how to classify her involvement. But it was clear that the devastating consequences of Elijah's actions had changed their lives forever. Elijah, on the other hand, would never face the justice he deserved for his crimes. The mental torment he had inflicted on his own soul had proven to be far worse than any punishment the law could deliver. The weight of his guilt had consumed him, and just 3 days after his bloody act of betrayal, he was found dead in his prison cell, a victim of his own demons. Karma, in all its bitter finality, had indeed come knocking, and no one who had played a part in the tragedy would ever be the same. The death of Pastor Elijah Moore sent shockwaves through the town of Glenview, but the tragedy did not end with his demise. While the physical bodies of Naomi, Teresa, and Elijah himself lay still, the consequences of the events that had unfolded left an indelible mark on the lives of everyone involved. The question that plagued the town, and the hearts of those who had loved the Moore family, was not simply one of justice but of judgment. Had the scales tipped too far? Had Elijah received the ultimate penalty through his own actions, or had the world failed to deliver the justice that his crimes demanded? Rachel Carter, the woman who had been at the center of the affair, sat in a small, cold interrogation room in the local police station. Her confession had sent ripples through the justice system, but now she found herself at the mercy of the law, facing charges for her involvement in the affair that had torn apart an entire family. She knew she couldn't escape the truth, but as the days passed and the legal proceedings began, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of justice she would face. She had already paid a steep price in terms of her own guilt, but would the court offer her any form of redemption, or would she too be lost in the sea of judgment? As the trial began, the townspeople gathered in the courthouse, eager to see the fate of the individuals who had once seemed like pillars of their community. Elijah Moore had been the trusted pastor, a man who had led them with wisdom, who had offered them counsel in their darkest hours. The Moore family had represented everything the town believed in: faith, unity, and love. But now, the same people who had once admired them were left to grapple with the overwhelming truth that Elijah was a murderer, and his family had paid the ultimate price for his sins. The courtroom was filled with tension as the charges against Rachel were read aloud. Murder, conspiracy, abuse of power, the list seemed endless. She had become the face of betrayal, the woman who had played a central role in the destruction of the Moore family. But as her defense attorney made his arguments, it became clear that Rachel wasn't a mere accomplice. She had been manipulated, deceived by a man who had used his power as a pastor to exploit her emotions and bring her into a web of lies. Her defense argued that Rachel was just as much a victim as Naomi and Teresa. They spoke of Elijah's manipulation, his ability to charm and control those around him, and how he had preyed on her vulnerability. They painted a picture of a young woman, confused and uncertain, who had fallen under the spell of a charismatic, but ultimately evil man. She wasn't a criminal in the same way Elijah was. She had been coerced, and the guilt she carried was a direct result of his actions, not her own. The prosecution, on the other hand, was determined to make sure that Rachel paid for her part in the tragedy. While they acknowledged Elijah's actions, they argued that Rachel had made a conscious choice to participate in the affair, to keep the secret, and most damning of all, to remain silent when the violence began. She had known what was happening, and instead of stopping it, she had chosen to stay involved, to stay complicit. Naomi, her best friend, had been killed by the man she had betrayed. And for that, the prosecution argued, Rachel could not be absolved of responsibility. In the midst of the trial, the townspeople were divided. Some believed that Rachel had been a victim, that the weight of her guilt and her role in Elijah's destruction was punishment enough. Others saw her as a willing participant in the affair, someone who had knowingly brought chaos into the Moore family's life. But the question lingered, had justice truly been served? As the weeks passed, the case became more about judgment than it did about the law. The town was torn between two opposing views. Should Rachel be punished for her part in the affair, or should she be seen as someone who had already paid for her crimes through the emotional toll of losing her best friend and living with the consequences of her actions? Meanwhile, the other side of the equation, the Moore family's legacy, loomed large. Elijah's death in prison had been swift, and many wondered whether he had gotten off easy. The man who had murdered his wife and daughter, who had destroyed everything he had built, had never faced trial, and he had never truly faced justice. He had taken his own life in the end, leaving the world to deal with the aftermath of his terrible deeds. Some felt that Elijah had been spared the pain of his own guilt, that he had never been forced to confront the enormity of his actions in the court of law. But others believed that Elijah's final act, his suicide, was the most fitting punishment of all. His conscience, it seemed, had been too much for him to bear. His death had been self-imposed, a consequence of the weight of the lives he had destroyed. In a sense, karma had already claimed him. The guilt that had eaten away at him had finally consumed him, leaving him with no choice but to take his own life. In the end, the verdict in Rachel's case was mixed. She was sentenced to serve time in prison, though the court acknowledged her psychological state and the manipulation she had endured at the hands of Elijah. While she was guilty of her involvement in the affair, the sentence was far less severe than many had expected. It was a decision that stirred anger in some and relief in others. Some felt she had received a fair judgment, while others believed she had escaped the consequences of her actions. The Moore family, however, would never return to the lives they had known. The memory of their tragedy would live on in the town for years to come, a reminder of how faith, betrayal, and family could intersect in the most horrifying ways. Justice had been served, but whether it was true justice, or merely judgment, was a question that no one could truly answer. As the final pages of the Moore family's tragic story turn, one cannot help but reflect on the haunting lesson that lies beneath it all. It's a tale of betrayal, of power abused, and of the dark corners of the human soul that are often hidden from view. But beneath the horror, the devastation, and the irreversible consequences, there's a sobering reminder of something crucial: the fragility of trust. In the beginning, Pastor Elijah Moore was seen as a man of faith, a leader who brought hope to his community. He was the rock upon which many built their lives, a man who had every appearance of being strong, reliable, and incorruptible. Yet in a matter of moments, his moral failures and hidden sins destroyed everything he had worked for. Naomi, his daughter, lost her life because of the very man who was supposed to protect her. Teresa, his wife, had placed her faith in him, only to find herself betrayed and ultimately silenced by his hands. This tragedy shows us the fragility of the relationships we trust the most and how easily they can be torn apart by lies, deceit, and an unwillingness to confront one's own demons. But perhaps the most significant lesson lies in the way Elijah Moore allowed his sins to fester unchecked, how he became so consumed by his own ego, his own desires, that he no longer saw the people around him as individuals but as pawns to be used in his desperate pursuit of something he could never truly have. His affair with Rachel, his callous treatment of his wife, and the ultimate betrayal of his daughter were all born from a profound disconnect from his own moral compass. He believed himself to be untouchable, invincible in the eyes of both his congregation and his family. But in the end, no one is invincible. And no secret, no matter how well hidden, remains buried forever. As the community of Glenview moved forward in the wake of the horror, they were left to reckon with their own role in the story. How had they, as a town, allowed this to happen? How had they placed their trust in someone who was capable of such monstrosities? Elijah was their pastor, their leader, their guide, but he was also a human being with flaws and weaknesses. And sometimes, when we place our trust in others without truly seeing who they are underneath the surface, the consequences can be catastrophic. Rachel too learned a harsh truth. The affair, which she once thought was born from love and affection, turned out to be nothing more than manipulation. She had been caught in the web of a man who had used her for his own purposes, and in doing so she lost everything. Her guilt was undeniable, but so too was her victimhood. She was, in many ways, the product of a society that had failed her, a product of a man who had known exactly how to exploit her vulnerabilities. She had learned the painful way that sometimes, the people we trust the most can become the ones who hurt us the deepest. The Moore family's story may have ended in tragedy, but it is far from an isolated incident. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. And yet, the lesson remains clear. Never place blind faith in someone even if they wear the mask of righteousness. We are all human, and sometimes, those we admire most are the ones who are capable of the greatest harm. But in the end, it is the choices we make that determine who we truly are, and no amount of power, no position of authority, can protect us from the consequences of our actions. The horror that unfolded in Elijah Moore's life serves as a stark reminder that karma is not a concept reserved for others. What we put into the world, good or evil, will come back to us. It might not happen immediately, but it will come, and it will find its way to our door when we least expect it. As for Rachel, her story will continue long after the trial. She will live with the scars of the past and perhaps find a path to redemption, one where she takes responsibility for her actions and the harm she caused. But for the Moore family there can be no return. Their lives were violently cut short, their hopes and dreams dashed by the very person they trusted most. This tragic tale serves as a chilling reminder that our actions have power, the power to uplift, to heal, but also the power to destroy. Trust is sacred, and once broken, it can never truly be repaired. In the end, the question remains, how far are we willing to go to protect what we hold dear, and how much are we willing to sacrifice when the truth comes to light?